Get comfortable, adjust your pillow, let the world outside go quiet for a little while. We are going somewhere cold and remote tonight, a place where the fog sits low against stone walls and the smell of wood smoke drifts out of chimneys that have been burning for centuries. A village so isolated that people outside its borders barely know it exists. A region of Spain that never quite made it into the modern era, where old roads wind through mountain passes and strange sounds carry further than they should in the dark. Resident Evil 4 is one of the most consequential games ever made. It redirected an entire genre. It changed the third-person shooter as a format. It introduced a parasite mythology so richly built that it has been echoing through sequels, films, and expanded lore for over 2 decades. But beneath the gameplay, beneath the iconic lines and the merchant and the laser corridors and the perfectly timed knife parries, there is a deep and genuinely strange story. A story about ancient organisms and centuries-old cults, about grief and ambition and the biology of control, about a government agent dropped into a nightmare that has been building since before he was born. Tonight we move through that story one fact at a time, 175 of them. We are not rushing, we are not cramming, we are settling in, letting the details accumulate the way dust accumulates in an abandoned room, slowly, quietly, until you realize just how much time has passed and how much history has gathered in the corners. Dim the lights if you can. Close your eyes when it feels right. The story will still be here. Let us begin. Section 1. Ancient Origins. Las Plagas and the World Before Los Iluminados, Facts 1 through 20. The Deep History. The part that predates every character in the game by thousands of years. Fact 1. The parasite at the center of Resident Evil 4 is called Las Plagas. Translated directly from Spanish, that phrase means the plagues, not a single plague. The plagues, plural. That choice of name tells you something about how the people who first encountered these organisms understood them. Not as a single catastrophe, but as an ongoing and multiplying condition. Something that kept arriving in new forms. Something that did not simply end. Fact 2. Las Plagas is classified as a genus of parasitic arthropods. That means they share a taxonomic category with creatures like crabs, insects, and spiders. Things with exoskeletons and segmented bodies. When you see the parasite emerge from a ganado's neck or erupt from a human torso, what you are looking at is not quite like anything that currently exists in the real natural world, but its biological architecture draws from organisms that absolutely do. The horror is partly in how familiar the shape is. Fact 3. The parasite appears to be genuinely ancient. Archaeological evidence found in the region of Valdelobos, the isolated Spanish area where the game takes place, suggests that humans were interacting with Las Plagas thousands of years before the events of the game. Cave art has been discovered in the caverns beneath Salazar Castle, depicting human sacrifice and what appear to be plaga organisms. These were not just drawings of local wildlife. They were ritualistic images. People understood these parasites held power, and they built ceremonies around that understanding long before anyone thought to weaponize them. Fact 4. One of the most important things about Las Plagas in its natural state is that it evolved to sustain extraordinarily long periods of dormancy in its embryonic form. The parasites found beneath Salazar Castle had been lying dormant for so long that even Sadler, when he first began excavating the site, was uncertain whether they had survived. They had. They were simply waiting. Patient in a way that only organisms without consciousness can truly be patient. They did not experience the wait. They simply existed through it, suspended, preserved, ready for a host that would eventually come. Fact 5. The parasites were found partially preserved within amber. Amber is fossilized tree resin, the same substance that famously preserves insects in the natural world over millions of years. The fact that the plagas were stored in amber is significant for a few reasons. First, it suggests the ancient civilization that once thrived in the caverns beneath Salazar Castle understood something about how to preserve these organisms, perhaps across intentional generational timescales. Second, it means the plagas that Sadler eventually worked with were not fresh specimens. They were ancient samples, reactivated. The amber also carries a special designation in the remake's lore, as a unique species of plaga was preserved within it, one that could potentially influence and even overthrow Sadler's own dominant strain. Fact 6. There are ruins of what appears to be a large ancient city in the caverns beneath Salazar Castle, not just scattered remains. Organized architecture, evidence of a civilization that built things meant to last. Who these people were, how long they lived in those caves, what their culture was like beyond its apparent reverence for Las Plagas, none of that has been definitively established in the lore. They are a gap in the historical record. A civilization that rose and fell, leaving only stone and the dormant eggs of their holy organism behind. Fact 7. The Plaga parasite spreads through the food chain. In-game documents confirm this. Animals that consumed infected matter could carry the parasite, and humans who then consumed those animals could be infected in turn. This explains why entire communities could fall under the parasite's influence without direct surgical implantation. It moved through ordinary ecological channels, through what people ate, through the invisible connections that bind every living thing in a region to every other. It spread the way slow things spread, through patience and the daily habits of survival. Fact 8. There are 3 primary species of Las Plagas in Resident Evil 4. The subordinate species, which is the most common form and is found in the majority of infected Ganados. The dominant species, which maintains a fundamentally different relationship with its host. And the Queen Plaga, which appears only once in the original game in a significant way, as a massive organism encountered in Salazar's castle, whose roots are actively producing new Plaga embryos. 3 distinct biological niches within the same genus. The parasite evolved social complexity into its own biology. Fact 9. Subordinate Plagas strip their hosts of free will. The mechanism for this appears to involve the parasite integrating with the host's nervous system and suppressing autonomous decision-making. Ganados infected with the subordinate species retain enough cognitive function to perform complex physical tasks. They can use weapons, coordinate ambushes, speak in Spanish to one another, and operate basic machinery. What they cannot do is choose for themselves. Every action they take is ultimately directed by the command structure built into the parasite hierarchy. They are controlled through ultrasonic frequencies issued by the dominant hosts above them. Fact 10. Dominant Plagas work very differently. An individual infected with a dominant species Plaga retains complete consciousness, full awareness, and their own individual personality and intelligence. They are not stripped of will. They are given additional capability. A dominant host can also use the high-frequency signals their parasite produces to directly control Ganados infected with the subordinate strain. This creates a hierarchy built into the biology itself. The parasite's social structure is a command chain encoded in living tissue. Fact 11. Sadler's personal Plaga is described in the lore as being further enhanced beyond the standard dominant species. He is more powerful than Salazar and Mendez, who also carry dominant strains. This suggests the parasites are not uniform, even within their species categories. Sadler either selectively engineered his own variant or received a particularly exceptional specimen. He sits at the top of a parasitic command structure that cascades downward through the entire infected population of the region. Fact 12. One of the most unsettling biological details about Las Plagas is what happens when a dominant host dies. When a dominant strain carrier is killed, all of the subordinate Ganados connected to that individual's command signal experience convulsions and become incapacitated. They do not simply stop taking orders, they suffer. Their nervous systems, which have been integrated with the parasite's signaling network, react to the sudden absence of the dominant frequency the way a circuit reacts to a power surge. It is a biological cascade failure. Fact 13. The Regeneradores are among the most disturbing BOWs created from Las Plagas research. They are not simply infected humans. They are the result of sustained and deliberate bioweapon development by Sadler's research team. Multiple Plaga parasites are implanted within a single host, and the result is an organism with a regenerative capability unlike anything else in the game. Damage a limb and it grows back. Blow a hole through the torso and the tissue fills itself in. The only way to reliably destroy a Regenerador is to locate and eliminate the individual Plaga organisms embedded throughout its body using thermal imaging. Without that, it simply keeps repairing itself. Fact 14. The Iron Maiden is a variant of the Regenerador, distinguished by the metal spikes that protrude from its body at irregular angles. In the original game, the Iron Maiden was understood as a distinct subspecies created through additional modification. In the 2023 remake, this distinction was altered. The Iron Maiden in the remake is presented as a natural mutation that can arise from the Regenerador. The spikes are not implanted. They are the product of the Plaga organisms within the host choosing to express differently under certain conditions. A natural outcome of an unnatural process. Fact. 15. El Gigante are among the largest enemies in the game, massive humanoid creatures created through specialized Plaga variants implanted into human test subjects. The infection triggers unrestrained muscle mass development in ways that make the host grow to an enormous scale. They are genuinely difficult to control. The lore notes that Los Illuminados created only a small number of El Gigante precisely because they were so dangerous to manage. Even Ganados were at risk from them. They were exceptional as weapons, but impractical as soldiers. They were stored in the coal mines and castle lower areas when they were not actively needed. Fact 16. Colmillos are wolves infected with Las Plagas. The Spanish word colmillo means fang, and the name suits them. Plaga infection in canines does not simply make them aggressive. It triggers the parasite to emerge from the host's spine as a writhing tentacle that extends outward and lashes independently of the animal. This creates a hybrid attack vector. The wolf moves with natural canine agility and predatory instinct. The parasite lashes from its back as a separate weapon. Two biological attack systems occupying the same body. Fact 17. The Novistadores are insectoid creatures that resulted from experiments combining human subjects with insect-specific Plaga mutations, partly through research associated with the Verdugo program. Their name comes from the Spanish word for unseen, which refers to their most distinctive ability. Novistadores can shift the pigmentation of their exoskeletons to become nearly invisible. They do not vanish completely. A careful observer can detect the shimmer of their outline and hear the skittering of their movement. But in the dark corridors of Salazar's castle, that shimmer is easy to miss until the acid bile hits. Fact 18. The Verdugo are the apex of what Los Illuminados accomplished with insect-human hybridization. Two served as Salazar's personal bodyguards, cloaked in the cult's ceremonial robes which hid their true forms. When one of them discards its robe and pursues Leon through the castle's underground, what is revealed is a creature with a chitinous exoskeleton, segmented limbs, bladed appendages, and a long scorpion-like tail. Its carapace is described in the lore as being harder than steel. Conventional weapons can slow it, but not reliably destroy it. The name Verdugo means executioner in Spanish. The choice was not accidental. Fact 19. The Salazar castle itself contains a queen plaga, an enormous plant-like organism that serves as a biological factory, producing new plaga embryos from its root structure. This creature exists in a semi-stationary state, fused to the architecture of the castle in a way that makes it feel like it grew there rather than was placed. It represents a different evolutionary expression of the plaga biology, one that prioritized reproduction and scale over mobility and aggression. In the remake, the Queen Plaga is incorporated into Salazar's mutation, becoming the form he takes as the castle's final boss, rather than existing as a separate encounter. Fact 20. Something important and often overlooked about Las Plagas is the distinction between how they spread in the original game versus what the remake adds. In the original, the primary vector is inhalation of spores from the excavated mine. Villagers breathing in dormant plaga fragments while working the mines is what begins the mass infection. In the remake, additional details complicate this picture. The amber containing the special plaga is treated with greater significance, and the social engineering required to get the villagers into the mines in the first place is given more narrative weight. The infection is not purely biological. It required manipulation, deception, and the calculated dismantling of a community's trust in its own institutions. The parasite needed a human architect to reach its hosts. Drop a comment right now letting me know what time it is where you are and what part of the world you're watching from. It always means a lot to see where these videos reach. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect moment. There is a lot more to get through tonight. Section 2. Los Illuminados. The cult that swallowed a region. facts 21 through 40. Fact 21. Los Illuminados translates from Spanish as the Enlightened Ones. The name is not simply grandiose self-promotion. It reflects the cult's core theological framework. To be infected with Las Plagas, according to their belief system, is to be enlightened. To surrender the individual will to the parasite, and by extension to the hierarchical structure it creates, is not submission. It is transcendence. It is the shedding of the ego's burdens and the embrace of something larger. This framing made the infection a sacrament, something sought rather than something feared. Fact 22. The historical record for Los Illuminados extends back centuries. A public emergence of the cult as a recognizable heretical sect has been dated in the remake's lore to 1554, marked by an inscription attributed to a figure named Prophet Adam Sadler. This is not the Sadler we know from the game. This is an ancestor, one of the founding generation of the Sadler family lineage that would eventually produce Osmond Sadler in the modern era. The family has been connected to this cult for at least 4.5 centuries. Osmond is not an opportunist who found the cult. He is its hereditary keeper. Fact 23. The broader lore suggests Los Illuminados may have roots in even older religious practices, potentially tracing back to the ancient civilization that built the ruins beneath Salazar Castle. There are indications that what became Los Illuminados was the continuation of a primal religion practiced by those cave dwellers. If that connection is genuine, the cult is not simply centuries old. It may be one of the oldest continuous religious traditions in the region, stretching back into a period before written records in that part of Spain. Fact 24. For most of their history, Los Illuminados were a persecuted minority, beginning with the Salazar family's crusade to restore Catholic primacy in Valdelobos. The cult faced repeated state-sanctioned massacres and inquisitions over the centuries. The first count of Valdelobos, Gregorio Salazar, is credited with effectively breaking the cult's public presence in the region during the 1700s. The Plaga eggs were sealed beneath the castle. Survivors went into exile. The family lineage connected to the cult went underground, passing knowledge and tradition through generations without the power to practice openly. For centuries, Los Illuminados existed as a memory in the mouths of descendants waiting for a moment to return. Fact 25. The relationship between the Salazar family and Los Illuminados is one of the stranger inversions in the game's backstory. The family was originally responsible for suppressing the cult and sealing away the Plaga. They were, by the standards of their time, the ones who stopped it. But then the family became stewards of the very thing they had buried, tasked with ensuring the castle and its underground secrets remained sealed. Generation after generation of Salazars committed to this guardianship without necessarily understanding everything they were guarding. And eventually, the guardianship produced Ramon Salazar, an orphaned child who would hand the keys to exactly the kind of person his ancestors had spent centuries trying to stop. Fact 26. By the late 20th century, the mass conversions that would transform the region began under Osmond Sadler's direct leadership. The conversion of Father Bitores Mendez proved to be the decisive moment. Mendez was not simply the village priest. He was the village elder. He held both religious and political authority over the entire community. When he converted, he brought the community with him. People who trusted Mendez, who had built their spiritual and civic lives around his guidance, followed him into the cult because the alternative was to distrust everything he had represented. The social infrastructure of faith became the delivery mechanism for mass infection. Fact 27. Villagers were not simply persuaded to accept the Plaga. They were subjected to a ritual framed as a cleansing. The injection of Plaga embryos was presented as a spiritual act, a washing away of sin, a purification that would bring them closer to the divine. People who submitted to this ritual did so believing they were participating in something sacred. The horror of consent here is exquisite. They agreed. They wanted it. They walked into infection with their eyes open because someone they trusted had made it look like grace. Fact 28. After the mass infections, the villagers returned to something approximating normal life. They farmed. They attended cult services at the local church. They worked as guards for Salazar's castle. They maintained the mining operations. From a distance, from the perspective of Spanish authorities who were aware of Los Illuminados' growing regional influence but did not pursue it actively, the village looked functional, controlled perhaps. Perhaps a bit zealous, but functional. The infection did not make the ganados look immediately monstrous. That only came under specific conditions, specific stresses, specific commands. Everyday life continued. The horror was beneath the surface, waiting. Fact 29. Children were not infected. This is stated in the lore, and it is significant. The plaga implantation process was fatal to children. Their bodies could not survive it. This means the cult's community was, in a biological sense, self-limiting. The next generation would be born human and would need to be infected as adults. This created a continuous cycle of conversion that required ongoing maintenance and ongoing deception. Every child who grew up in the village was eventually brought through the ritual as an adult, surrendering their will in a ceremony that those around them had normalized. There was no opting out of a process that everyone you knew described as sacred. Fact 30. The cult's insignia, the symbol used on robes and banners and carved into the castle walls, is a design that Oswell Spencer directly borrowed when creating the logo for Umbrella Corporation in the main Resident Evil timeline. Spencer encountered Miranda's village, which itself had connections to the Illuminados mythology through the broader European bioweapon research community. The Umbrella logo, that familiar red and white pattern, carries the geometric heritage of an ancient Spanish parasite cult. Every time you see that symbol in any Resident Evil game, you are looking at something whose roots run back to the caverns beneath Salazar's castle. Fact 31. Sadler's plan for world domination was specific and staged. He was not simply trying to spread the plaga globally in a chaotic way. He wanted to use Ashley Graham as the vector. By infecting the president's daughter with a specially prepared plaga embryo and then returning her to the United States, he intended to use her to infect high-ranking government officials. From there, the infection would spread through the command structure of the world's most powerful government. Control the infrastructure, control the decisions, control the military, and the rest follows. It was a remarkably patient and precise plan for a man in charge of a remote cult. Fact 32. The cult had already effectively replaced Catholicism as the dominant religion in Valdalobos by 2004. Spanish authorities recognized this but did not actively pursue the matter. This is worth sitting with. An ancient parasite cult had openly supplanted the Catholic Church in a region of Spain, and the government's response was acknowledgement without intervention. The cult had political cover, whether through bribery, through strategic intimidation, through the simple bureaucratic difficulty of prosecuting religious activity in a remote rural area. They had insulated themselves from the authorities who should theoretically have stopped them years earlier. Fact 33. The cult's paramilitary operations were not confined to the village and castle. They maintained an island facility nearby equipped with sophisticated military hardware, research laboratories, and a trained security force. The island soldiers are visually distinct from the village ganados and the castle zealots. They wear military gear, they use advanced firearms. They coordinate with tactical discipline that goes beyond what untrained villagers could demonstrate. This operation required real funding, real procurement channels, real connections to arms suppliers and military contractors. Los Illuminados had infrastructure that went far beyond what a rural Spanish cult would ordinarily possess. Fact 34. The cult's religious practices incorporated elements of Roman Catholicism, but layered them over a fundamentally different theological core. The language of sin, redemption, and divine will remained. The framework of a prophet, a holy organism, and a congregation performing ritual submission also remained. What changed was the object of devotion. The parasite replaced God, or rather, the parasite was presented as God's instrument, the mechanism through which divine will was expressed in the body. This syncretic structure made the cult easier to sell to people raised Catholic. It was familiar enough to be trusted, different enough to be exciting. Fact 35. Members who resisted or attempted to leave the cult after infection faced consequences that the biology itself enforced. A ganado infected with a subordinate plaga cannot simply decide to stop following orders. The parasite's control is not psychological, it is neurological. There is no act of will strong enough to overcome it for most hosts. The control is total and physical. Resistance is not a choice available to the subordinate infected. The cult designed it this way. Commitment to Los Illuminados was written into the nervous system of every convert, permanent and irrevocable from the moment the embryo took hold. Fact 36. There is evidence in the game's files and documents that Sadler was, at least in some versions of his characterization, genuinely uncertain about whether the Plaga were divine or simply biological. In one reading, he viewed both the cult and the parasites as tools for his own power. In another, as the legitimate heir of the founding family, he truly believed in the theology. His faith may have been authentic. His ambition was certainly authentic. Whether those two things were at war inside him or existed in comfortable alignment is a question the lore intentionally leaves unresolved. It is more disturbing if both were true simultaneously. Fact 37. The conversion of the village happened gradually enough that Spanish authorities did not trigger an emergency response. This required careful management of appearances. The cult could not afford a sudden mass behavioral change that attracted outsiders, so the transformation was staged. Individual conversions, gradual shifts in church attendance, the slow replacement of Catholic iconography with Illuminados symbols, a community changing its face, one household at a time, over years rather than collapsing into obvious chaos overnight. The patience required for this operation is staggering when you consider that Sadler was simultaneously managing bioweapon research and planning the kidnapping of the president's daughter. Fact 38. Luis Serra was born in Valdalobos. He grew up in the village before it was fully converted. This means he watched the transformation happen from the inside. He saw his home community shift from a devout Catholic village to an Illuminado stronghold. He watched his neighbors become ganados. He had the context of knowing what these people had been before the parasite, knowing them as individuals, as farmers and churchgoers, and people with ordinary, complicated human lives, before watching them become something controlled and changed. When he worked as Sadler's researcher, this background shaped his eventual decision to betray the cult. He was not destroying strangers. He was trying to undo what had been done to the place and people he came from. Fact 39. The term ganado comes from the Spanish word ganado, meaning cattle or livestock. The people infected with the subordinate plaga were literally named livestock by the cult that infected them. This naming was not accidental or casual. It was a deliberate dehumanization embedded in the cult's internal language. To be a ganado was not simply to be infected. It was to be categorized as a resource, as property, as something owned and directed rather than someone living and choosing. The cruelty of this naming convention is one of the quiet horrors that the game does not announce, but simply leaves in the Spanish dictionary for anyone willing to look it up. Fact 40. After the events of Resident Evil 4, the Plaga parasites found their way onto the black market as bioweapons. The cult's leadership was destroyed, their research capabilities were dismantled. But the organisms themselves survived the operation's aftermath and began circulating in the global arms trade. This is not a background detail. It is the origin point for the Plaga-based threats that appear in subsequent games, including the variants developed by Tricell in Africa for the events of Resident Evil 5. What Sadler built in a remote Spanish village did not die with him. It scattered into the world and kept mutating and kept finding new architects willing to rebuild it for different purposes. The parasite, as ever, proved patient. Section 3. The men who made it possible. Sadler, Salazar, and Mendez. Facts 41 through 60. Fact 41. Osmond Sadler is, in terms of his relationship to the broader Resident Evil mythology, genuinely unusual. He is the first major Resident Evil villain who has no direct connection to the Umbrella Corporation. Every primary antagonist before him had some link to Umbrella's research, Umbrella's viruses, Umbrella's people. Sadler arrived from a completely different direction. His bioweapon was older than Umbrella. His cult predated Spencer's ambitions. He represents a parallel track of horror, evidence that the world of Resident Evil was never only Umbrella's creation. There were other things growing in the dark, long before Spencer found the progenitor virus. Fact 42. In the original game, Sadler's background is left largely mysterious. He is described as a bioweapons research chief who somehow learned about the Plaga in Los Illuminados, but his origins are not detailed. His non-Spanish name, Osmund, suggests he may not be native to the Valdalobos region. The mystery of how this outsider found an ancient Spanish parasite cult and became its leader is one the original game does not resolve. He simply arrives in the lore as a fully formed power, already in possession of the cult's leadership, already conducting the experiments, already planning the world domination. The origin question hangs there unanswered in the original. Fact 43. The remake fills in significant background. In that version, Sadler is the 15th generation descendant of the family that founded Los Illuminados. He is not an outsider at all. He is the direct hereditary heir of the cult's founding bloodline, the surviving end of a lineage that has carried this tradition for nearly 5 centuries. Adam Sadler inscribed the founding text in 1554. Osmond Sadler inherited it. The remake's version of this character is someone who grew up knowing exactly who he was and what his family had built, watching the ruins of the cult around him and deciding to restore them. Fact 44. Sadler's method for entering the Salazar castle and accessing the Plaga required him to first insinuate himself into Ramon Salazar's life. He did this by arriving as a healer. Young Ramon suffered from an illness that was expected to prevent him from reaching adulthood. The boy's mother, Catalina, invited Sadler and his cult to treat her son over the objections of her husband Diego. Sadler cured Ramon by infecting him with a dominant species Plaga. This was not simply medicine. This was recruitment through a child's desperation to survive. Sadler gave Ramon life and in the same gesture bound him to the cult's biology, its beliefs, and its ambitions. Fact 45. After curing Ramon, Sadler had Diego Salazar killed. Catalina disappeared afterward. The details of both events are not elaborated in the lore, which makes them more disturbing rather than less. The family that had guarded the sealed Plaga for generations was systematically dismantled. The father who had opposed Sadler's presence was eliminated. The mother who had invited him in disappeared without recorded explanation. And the orphaned child, freshly infected, freshly grateful, freshly alone, handed Sadler the keys to the castle and everything beneath it. Fact 46. Ramon Salazar is one of the most visually distinctive characters in the game, a small and pale figure in elaborate nobleman's attire who presents himself with an air of theatrical grandeur that sits at odds with both his physical stature and the genuine horror of what he represents. He is a child who lost everything and found belonging in something that replaced his family with a cult and his individuality with a parasite. His theatrical personality, his elaborate death traps, his obsession with ceremony and ritual. These are the behaviors of someone performing a version of aristocratic identity because the real version was taken from him before he could fully develop it. Fact 47. Salazar was infected with a dominant species Plaga, making him a commander within the parasite hierarchy. He could control the zealots and cultists in his castle. His physical mutations were less dramatic than Mendez's, at least until his final boss form. He retained a mostly human appearance throughout the game until the moment of his death, when the Plaga within him erupts in spectacular fashion, transforming him into a massive creature that fuses with the castle's own infrastructure and with a large Plaga organism. Even in dying, Salazar cannot simply fall. Everything about him has to be an event. Fact 48. In both the original game and the remake, Leon and Salazar's dynamic is deeply unusual. Salazar is actively taunting from a position of perceived superiority, and Leon keeps responding with a kind of bored amusement that completely deflates whatever menace Salazar is trying to project. In the original, this produces some of the most gleefully ridiculous dialogue in the series. In the remake, it is handled with more weight, Salazar being more directly sinister and Leon more genuinely tense. Both versions work precisely because the dynamic between them illuminates something real about both characters. Leon does not take Salazar seriously. Salazar desperately wants to be taken seriously. That gap is where all the tension lives. Fact 49. Father Bitores Mendez deserves more attention than he typically receives in discussions of the game. He is arguably the most important figure in the conversion of Valdilobos, more directly responsible for what happened to the village than even Sadler. Mendez was the village's Catholic priest and political elder before the cult arrived. He was the person the villagers trusted most. By converting him, Sadler did not simply add one follower. He transformed the entire community's existing trust infrastructure into a delivery mechanism for the cult. Every relationship Mendez had built as a priest became a pathway to Illuminado's conversion. Fact 50. Mendez was injected with a dominant species Plaga as part of what was framed to him as a cleansing ritual. Whether Mendez was deceived about what the infection would do, Whether he chose it willingly with full understanding, or whether he was coerced by the already infected Salazar, using his position over the boy's remaining local authority, the lore is not entirely clear. What is clear is that after the infection, Mendez became one of the most powerful physical threats in the game, and one of Sadler's most loyal lieutenants. He controlled the village ganados directly. His presence in the community was the reason the mass infection could be managed without spiraling into obvious chaos. Fact 51. Mendez's physical mutation from the dominant plaga produced something genuinely nightmarish. He towers above normal humans, with proportions that suggest the parasite extended his skeleton significantly. His body is coated in a thick layer of mutated tissue. His most distinctive feature is the ability to detach his upper body from his lower body completely, the spine extending outward as a prehensile limb, while the lower half continues moving independently. When Leon fights Mendez in the burning barn in the village section of the game, this is what he faces. Not a man, not a monster. Something in between those categories that has transcended normal anatomical rules and is still somehow enraged, still somehow purposeful, still moving toward him with intent. Fact 52. Mendez is described as one of only a handful of people in whom Sadler genuinely places trust. The lore suggests Sadler was saddened by Mendez's death, though his notes frame it in a complicated way that acknowledges having initially viewed Mendez primarily as a pawn. This is consistent with Sadler's overall character, a man capable of something that functions like loyalty and grief, but who always ultimately understood his relationships in terms of utility. Mendez was useful. When he died, something that functioned like loss appeared in Sadler, alongside the tactical calculation of what that loss meant for his plans. Fact 53. The village church in Resident Evil 4 is one of the most architecturally significant spaces in the game from a lore perspective. It is where Ashley is initially held when Leon arrives. It was a functioning Catholic church before the cult converted the village. The stained glass windows, the altar, the pews, all of it is still there. But it has been overlaid with Illuminato's iconography and transformed in its function from a place of Christian worship into a site for cult rituals. The building itself is a physical record of the conversion, two religious layers occupying the same space, one buried under the other. Fact 54. Sadler had Leon captured and infected with a subordinate plaga embryo on the day of his arrival in Valdelobos. He did not simply want Leon dead. He was impressed enough by Leon's survival skills to consider keeping him alive as a future personal bodyguard once the parasite fully developed, and gave Sadler complete control. This is significant because it reveals something about how Sadler's mind worked. He was not purely destructive. He was acquisitive. He saw value in people and sought to transform them into assets rather than simply eliminating them. That impulse, combined with his underestimation of Leon's ability to locate and use the parasite removal equipment, is what ultimately contributed to his defeat. Fact 55. Sadler personally killed Luis Serra after discovering his betrayal. He did not delegate this. Luis had stolen a dominant plaga sample, the amber, and was attempting to hand it over to Ada Wong in exchange for protection. When Sadler caught up with him, he struck personally. The manner of the killing, a single strike through the chest with something from his enhanced body, was almost casual in its efficiency. Sadler had built an operation that required Luis's expertise, and then Luis had turned against it. The killing reads in context not as rage, but as administrative conclusion. A resource had become a liability. The resource was removed. Fact 56. Sadler's physical mutation in his final boss form transforms him into something loosely arachnide in its architecture, a massive body supported on blade-tipped legs with a dominant eye that is his primary vulnerability. This eye is the plaga organism itself made visible, the parasite no longer concealed within the host, but extended outward as the command center of an enormous mutated body. Shooting that eye is not simply damaging the host, it is attacking the controlling organism directly. In a strange way, the final boss of Resident Evil 4 is not Sadler the man. It is Las Plagas wearing the remnants of a man. Fact 57. The staff Sadler carries throughout the game, his ceremonial walking stick, is organic. It is not carved wood or metal. It is a living plaga structure, fleshy, with moving tendrils that respond to his commands. When he mutates, it transforms into a tentacle that replaces his right arm. The staff was never a prop. It was always a biological extension of the same organism that gave him his authority and his power. He was carrying a piece of himself in his hand the entire game and presenting it as a symbol of his position. Fact 58. In the remake, Sadler is played with greater reserve than in the original. The original Sadler was grandiose and theatrical in a way that matched the original game's slightly heightened tone. The remake's Sadler speaks more quietly. He moves more deliberately. He is calm in a way that suggests absolute certainty rather than performance. He does not need to posture because he genuinely believes he has already won. This certainty, more than any speech about world domination, is what makes him feel dangerous. Fanaticism that has converted itself into patience is more frightening than fanaticism that shouts. Fact 59. The full extent of the island's military hardware is suggested but not entirely detailed in the game itself. There are anti-aircraft capabilities. There are warships. There are laboratories with equipment sophisticated enough to have produced the Regenerador and conducted genetic modification at a level that rivals what dedicated biotech companies were doing in the larger Resident Evil universe. All of this on a private island belonging to a Spanish cult. The question of who funded it, who supplied it, and who looked the other way while it was assembled is one of those background mysteries the game gestures at without fully resolving. Fact 60. After Sadler's death, with Ada taking the dominant Plaga sample and the island destroyed, the Los Illuminados as an organization effectively ceased to exist. Their leadership was dead, their research was destroyed, their base was rubble, but the cult's lasting consequence was the dispersal of the Plaga biology into the global bioweapons market. What could not be contained, what would go on to cause further suffering in Africa and Eastern Europe and beyond, was not the cult itself. It was the knowledge, the organism, the living legacy of what Sadler built in that remote village, escaping the blast radius and finding new homes in new hands with new ambitions. The cult died. The Plaga lived on. Section 4. Leon S. Kennedy, The Man Before the Mission, Facts 61 through 80. Fact 61. Leon Scott Kennedy was born in 1977. By the time the events of Resident Evil 4 take place in early 2004, he is 26 years old. He has already lived through what most people would consider several lifetimes of extraordinary experience. He lost his parents at a young age. He enrolled in the police academy and graduated at 21. He arrived in Raccoon City for his very first day as a police officer on September 29, 1998, which happened to be the day the T-virus outbreak was already well underway. He had not yet clocked in when the city began its transformation into a disaster that would kill most of its population. Fact 62. Leon was late to his first shift because of a personal crisis the night before. A bad breakup with a girlfriend left him enough of a mess that he drank, and he arrived in Raccoon City hours after he was supposed to report. This is one of the quiet ironies built into his backstory. The thing that saved his life, the thing that meant he was not already inside the police department when it was overrun, was not heroism or preparation or tactical wisdom. It was heartbreak. It was sitting in whatever passed for a bar the night before and drinking too much over a relationship that ended. The most significant survival choice of his early career was made by accident. Fact 63. The Raccoon City incident was Leon's trial by absolute extremity. He entered a city that had collapsed. He navigated the police department, the sewers, the laboratory underneath it. He encountered the creatures Umbrella's research had produced. He emerged alive with Claire Redfield and a child named Sherry Birkin. The version of Leon Kennedy who walked into Raccoon City as a rookie cop who had never seen combat, and the version who walked out of it are not the same person in any meaningful psychological sense. He came out of that city already something different from what he had been. Fact 64. After Raccoon City, Leon was not free to simply return to civilian life. He was identified by the government as someone with first-hand knowledge of what Umbrella had done, someone who had been inside the outbreak and survived it with his mental clarity intact. He was conscripted into a classified government unit with an anti-bioterrorism focus. This was presented as recruitment, but it carried the unmistakable character of coercion. Leon did not apply for this position. He was told he was taking it. The distinction between the government he had joined as a police officer to serve and the organization that now owned his career had effectively collapsed. Fact 65. The years between Raccoon City in 1998 and the Valdelobos mission in 2004 involved significant government training and fieldwork that is only partially detailed in the canon. His skills with firearms, with hand-to-hand combat, with the kind of improvisational decision-making that keeps someone alive in chaotic situations, were built during this period. He did not arrive in Spain as the same person who had fumbled through Raccoon City. He arrived as someone who had spent 6 years being systematically prepared for exactly the kind of situation he was about to face. Fact 66. Before the RE-4 mission, Leon partnered with a U.S. Special Operations Command operative named Jack Krauser on a mission in South America in 2002. This is detailed in Resident Evil, The Dark Side Chronicles. The mission involved a South American drug lord named Javier Hidalgo, who had connections to the bioweapon black market and had obtained viral samples that were creating monsters in the region. This mission is where Leon and Krauser's relationship was forged, and it is also where Krauser sustained the severe arm injury that would define everything he did afterward. Their partnership on that mission is the foundation that makes Krauser's betrayal in RE-4 so pointed. He was not just an enemy, he was someone Leon had trusted. Fact 67. Krauser's arm was severely injured during the South American operation. The nature of the injury is significant because it ended his military career. Krauser had built his entire identity around being a physically exceptional soldier. He was defined by his capability, his strength, his skill. The injury did not simply wound him. It amputated the central premise of who he believed himself to be. When he began searching for a way to restore and exceed what he had lost, the road he chose led directly to the Plaga. Fact 68. After the South American mission, Krauser was reported dead in a helicopter crash. This was a deliberate deception. He had arranged to disappear, to exit his previous life cleanly, in order to seek out Albert Wesker without his former superiors being any the wiser. He had identified Wesker as someone who could give him what he wanted, power, specifically biological power, sufficient to compensate for his injury and then surpass it. The fake death is a measure of how completely he had committed to this new path. He burned his previous identity, his career, his standing, his relationships, for the possibility of becoming something more than what his injury had reduced him to. Fact 69. Leon's assigned mission in Resident Evil 4 is initially described as relating to his role as a protective agent for the president's family. By the time of the events in 2004, he had been promoted to serve in that capacity. The official framing of the RE-4 mission is that the president's daughter has been kidnapped by a mysterious group in rural Spain. Leon is sent with a small support team including Spanish police escorts, both of whom die very quickly in the game's opening sequence, to locate and retrieve Ashley Graham. That is the full official scope of what he knows when he gets on the plane. The cult, the parasite, the world domination plan, all of that is discovered once he is already there and there is no clean way out. Fact 70. The support infrastructure Leon has during the RE-4 mission is notably thin. He has radio contact with his handler Ingrid Hunnigan back in the United States, but she is cut off early in the game after the cult jams local communications. After that, Leon is functionally operating without any institutional support at all. He is one person in a foreign country where almost everyone he encounters has been infected with mind-controlling parasites, with no backup, no extraction plan that can be immediately executed, and a critical mission objective that requires keeping a non-combatant alive while fighting through 3 distinct enemy-controlled environments. This operational reality, one man against a region, is presented fairly matter-of-factly by the game, and deserves more appreciation than it usually gets. Fact 71. Leon's relationship with Ada Wong first developed during the events of Resident Evil 2, when they met in the chaos of the Raccoon City outbreak. Ada was operating under deep cover there, tasked with obtaining a G-virus sample, though she concealed this entirely from Leon. What developed between them during those events was genuinely complicated. Real trust and something approaching real feeling existed alongside fundamental deception on Ada's part. Leon knew after Raccoon City that Ada had not been entirely honest with him. He did not know the full extent of what she had withheld. Their dynamic in RE-4 carries all of that history. Every time she appears to help him, he cannot fully determine whether it is because she wants to or because it serves some other agenda he cannot see. Fact 72. Leon's initial response when he realizes Krauser is alive and working for Sadler is one of the more psychologically interesting moments in the game. He is not simply angry. He is also something more specific, a kind of recognition that the person he partnered with, the person he thought he understood, was never quite the person he believed he knew. Krauser did not become corrupt after their partnership. He was becoming it during it, making calculations that Leon was not aware of, heading toward a destination that he had not disclosed. The betrayal retroactively rewrites the memory of the partnership without erasing it. Fact 73. The knife is more central to Leon's character in the RE4 remake than in the original. The original Leon used a knife situationally. The remake's Leon is defined by his knife work in a way that makes it feel like a signature. The knife fight with Krauser, which in the original was a sequence of quick-time events, becomes in the remake a full combat encounter that showcases knife techniques and close-quarters strategies. This change aligns Leon more completely with his earlier characterization as someone trained for intimate violence as much as firearm combat. Fact 74. Leon's codename during the RE4 operation is Condor 1. This is a small detail that most players probably do not notice because it appears only in the context of how his handlers address him in radio communications. But codenames are operational. They exist to provide deniability, to allow the government to acknowledge the mission without acknowledging the individual. Leon is not Leon in his government's official records of this operation. He is Condor 1. The person inside that name, the man with the complicated relationship history and the Raccoon City trauma and the Krauser partnership, is administrative background. Fact 75. By the end of Resident Evil 4, Leon has killed 3 out of 4 of Sadler's principal lieutenants, dealt with the Krauser situation, destroyed the island's military infrastructure through Ada's explosives detonating it, and extracted the president's daughter alive. He has done all of this while himself carrying a Plaga embryo that was progressively developing inside him and that Sadler was increasingly attempting to activate remotely to seize control of his body. The parasite removal did not happen until relatively late in the game's timeline. For most of his time in Valdalobos, Leon was operating with a biological time bomb inside him, while trying not to think too hard about what would happen if he ran out of anticonvulsants. Fact 76. Leon's final confrontation with Sadler takes place after Ada has been captured and suspended. Leon cuts her down. They have their familiar moment of complicated acknowledgement, and then Sadler attempts to use the Plaga control signal on Leon, who should still theoretically be vulnerable to it. It does not work. Leon has already received the suppression treatment that Luis provided. Sadler's surprised pause at this failure is brief, but it captures something important about the entire operation. Sadler consistently underestimated the degree to which the people in his path had already found ways to work around the systems he controlled. Fact 77. Ada's delivery of the rocket launcher to Leon in the final boss fight mirrors almost exactly a moment from 6 years earlier in Raccoon City. In RE2, Ada also threw Leon a rocket launcher during a critical moment. The detail is not accidental. It creates a thread of repetition between their encounters that functions as a kind of language between them. They have a history of specific things, and the rocket launcher handoff is one of its recurring vocabulary words. Regardless of everything complicated and unresolved between them, in the moment of maximum crisis, Ada throws Leon the thing he needs to survive. Fact 78. After the events of RE4, Leon writes his mission report documenting everything that happened in Valdalobos. This report, referred to in the lore as the Kennedy Report, becomes an important document in the broader Resident Evil timeline. Its contents inform Chris Redfield's understanding of the Plaga biology and contribute to BSAA operational planning in subsequent years. What Leon discovered in Spain, the parasite hierarchy, the dominant and subordinate mechanics, the removal methodology, all of it is passed forward through the intelligence chain and shapes how the world responds to subsequent Plaga-related crises. Fact 79. Leon's emotional and psychological state after Raccoon City is addressed more directly in the Infinite Darkness miniseries than in the games themselves. He carries the weight of what happened there throughout his career. He lost his belief in uncomplicated institutional trust during that outbreak. He knows what governments can do with bioweapons because he watched Umbrella do it with government knowledge. This skepticism, This fundamental understanding that official reassurances can be catastrophically wrong is part of what makes him effective in the field. He does not assume the situation is what he was briefed on. He assumes there are layers he has not been told about. Fact 80. Leon is 26 in Resident Evil 4. He is already, by that age, among the most accomplished anti-bioterrorism operatives in the world. He defeated the aftermath of the Raccoon City outbreak at 21. He completed a South American mission involving live bioweapon threats at 24. He dismantled the entire Illuminados operation at 26. By the time he reaches his 30s, he has more direct field experience against living biological weapons than almost any other person on Earth. This context is part of what makes his later emotional fatigue and the trauma visible in his appearance in Resident Evil 6, where he looks noticeably older and more worn, feel earned rather than arbitrary. Section 5. The supporting cast. Ada, Luis, Krauser, and Ashley. Facts 81 through 105. Fact 81. Ada Wong's name has become synonymous in the Resident Evil series with the word unreliable. Not unreliable in the sense of incompetent. Unreliable in the sense of always operating from a position of partial disclosure. She is truthful about some things and strategically silent about others, and the line between the two shifts based on what she is trying to accomplish. In RE4, she is ostensibly working for Wesker and the HCF organization. But she has her own agenda that partially overlaps with Wesker's and partially works against it. When she ultimately hands Wesker a subordinate plaga, rather than the dominant plaga sample she was supposed to deliver, she is not making a mistake. She is choosing a different outcome than the one her employer wanted. Fact 82. Ada's expertise that makes her useful in the RE4 context is multi-dimensional. She is a trained operative comfortable with firearms and close-quarters combat. She is also a skilled scientist capable of understanding the biological research being done in Sadler's facilities well enough to know which samples are valuable and why. She is additionally capable of impersonating, gathering intelligence, navigating hostile environments without direct confrontation, and managing relationships, including those with people who should theoretically be her enemies. The fact that she actively helps Leon survive on multiple occasions while officially working for an organization that has no interest in Leon's survival says something precise about where her actual loyalties sit. Fact 83. In the Separate Ways side story, which follows Ada's perspective on the same events of RE4, the picture of what she was actually doing becomes significantly fuller. She was managing 3 separate sets of expectations simultaneously. Wesker's expectations, Sadler's expectations, since she was operating within the cult's facility while pretending to be on their side to a degree, and her own agenda, which included protecting Leon, obtaining the amber, and ensuring that whoever she ultimately delivered the sample to would not be able to immediately use it for the mass destruction Wesker was planning. The level of simultaneous deception she maintains across the game is genuinely extraordinary from a tactical standpoint. Fact 84. In the remake, Ada's betrayal of Wesker is shown explicitly in a video call at the end of Separate Ways. Wesker explains his plan to use the plaga to murder billions of people as the foundation of his Ouroboros project. Ada, who has operated in moral gray zones throughout her career, listens to this and hangs up on him. Then she forces the helicopter pilot at gunpoint to change course. This is the moment where her particular brand of self-interested pragmatism runs directly into something she is unwilling to be part of. She will deceive, manipulate, and steal. She will not participate in the extinction of billions. That line, unstated before the remake, is now on the record. Fact 85. Luis Serra Navarro was born and raised in Valdelobos. He left to pursue education and eventually a career, first with what he described as police work in Madrid, in the original game, and then in a significantly darker direction in the remake. In the remake's version of his backstory, Luis was recruited by Umbrella Corporation's European branch directly out of university and worked at their Laboratory 6, which was the same facility responsible for the development of the Nemesis BOWW. He worked under William Birkin, the sociopathic research chief who would later cause the Raccoon City outbreak by engineering the G-virus. Luis's hands, in the remake version, are genuinely not clean before the events of RE4. Fact 86. The Laboratory 6 connection in the remake does something important to Luis's character. It makes his redemption arc in RRE4 more morally weighted than the original. Original Luis is a researcher who realized Sadler was genuinely evil and tried to do the right thing. Remake Luis is someone who was trained in the moral economy of Umbrella, who contributed to bioweapon research at a facility that produced the Nemesis, who left that environment and found himself working for a different monster in his own hometown. His choice to betray Sadler and help Leon carries the additional weight of someone who has been complicit in this kind of horror before and is choosing this time differently. Fact 87. Luis created the suppression medication that Leon and Ashley used to slow the Plaga's development. He also designed the laser surgery machine on the island that ultimately removes the parasites from both of them. This technology, the ability to destroy Plaga organisms from within a living host without killing the host, is one of the most significant pieces of research that results from the RE4 events. It is the difference between a bioweapon that can be removed and one that cannot. Luis understood the biology well enough to find the exit. He just did not live long enough to see it used. Fact 88. Luis dies at Sadler's hands in the castle, struck from behind while trying to deliver the suppressant and amber sample to Leon. His death happens quickly and without ceremony, which is part of why it hits so hard. He was helping. He was seconds away from completing an action that would have significantly improved Leon and Ashley's odds of survival. Sadler interrupts it. The amber is taken. Luis collapses and uses his final moments to deliver what information he still can. He tells Leon what he needs to know and then is gone. In the remake, this scene is given more emotional depth through the relationship the game has built between him and Leon in the preceding hours. Fact 89. The character of Luis in the remake makes numerous references to Don Quixote, the classic Spanish literary knight. He calls Leon his squire at one point and Ashley Princess Dulcinea. This is not just comedic flavoring. Don Quixote is a story about a man who decides to be heroic in a world that no longer has a place for heroes, who does genuinely noble things while being treated as absurd by everyone around him, who ultimately cannot survive the gap between the world as he imagines it should be and the world as it actually is. Luis choosing this reference for himself is a signal about how he understands his own situation. He knows he is tilting at windmills. He chooses to do it anyway. Fact 90. In the original game's trial edition, Luis had a mustache. This was removed from the final character model before release. He does still have it on his bottle cap collectible figure, which is a tiny, strange piece of historical preservation. Every copy of the original game's pre-release materials that showed Luis with that mustache is a document from a different timeline, a Luis that the finished game does not contain, but that existed in the development process long enough to be manufactured into a small plastic toy. Fact 91. Jack Krauser kidnapped Ashley Graham himself, personally. He did not delegate this. He made contact with the cult, established his infiltration through Wesker's network, and then executed the kidnapping directly as his entry point into Sadler's operation. This gave Krauser credibility with Sadler, the kind of credibility you only get by delivering something the other person values. He delivered the president's daughter. In exchange, he received the dominant Plaga infection he was seeking, a transaction with political, biological, and personal dimensions folded together into a single action. Fact 92. Krauser's left arm, the one that was damaged in the South American mission, is the arm that the Plaga mutation transforms into a blade. The biology apparently worked along existing injury pathways, finding the damaged tissue and expressing its mutations there rather than uniformly throughout the body. The arm becomes a massive bone and tissue blade capable of blocking firearms' fire and delivering devastating strikes. This is both functionally effective as a weapon and personally meaningful. The arm that represented his limitation, that ended his military career, became the site of his transformation into something that exceeded all the limits he had faced. Fact 93. In the original game, Ada kills Krauser in the Separate Ways campaign after Leon has left him for dead. In the remake, this dynamic is changed significantly. Krauser's final battle is with Leon alone. He is incapacitated from the injuries he sustains during their fight, and, knowing he is dying, he asks Leon to finish him with his own knife. Leon does. This revised ending removes Ada from Krauser's death entirely and makes the conclusion of that relationship something between the two people who actually shared it, the mentor and the student, the former partner and the man who became his enemy. Fact 94. Krauser's dying words in the remake are that he trained Leon well. This is one of those moments where the line between sincerity and provocation becomes genuinely unclear. He might mean it as genuine pride in what Leon became. He might mean it as a final claim of credit for the person who defeated him, a way of taking ownership of his own death. He might mean it as an acknowledgement that the two of them were, at some point, genuinely the same kind of person before their paths diverged, probably all three simultaneously. The game does not clarify it and is better for that choice. Fact 95. After Krauser's death, Albert Wesker had his body recovered. The purpose was to extract the superior species Plaga from Krauser's remains as a contingency against Ada's potential failure or refusal to deliver the sample. Wesker was operating with multiple redundancies throughout ERE-4. Ada was his primary asset, but not his only one. Krauser was his primary infiltration operative, but had always been operating with the awareness that Wesker viewed people as resources, and dead resources could still be harvested if you reached them quickly enough. This detail is grotesque in a way that summarizes Wesker's character economy more efficiently than many longer passages of dialogue. Fact 96. Ashley Graham is 20 years old at the time of the game's events. She is a university student in Massachusetts, returning home when Krauser's kidnapping operation intercepts her somewhere in Europe. She has had no training for anything that is about to happen to her. She is not a soldier, not a government operative, not someone who has been preparing for bioterrorism encounters. She is a young woman who was going home and instead found herself being transported across a continent to a cult that wanted to use her as a vector for infecting the United States government. Fact 97. Ashley in the original game received significant criticism for her helplessness as a character. She could not fight. She screamed when enemies approached. She required constant supervision. The designers made a deliberate choice to make protecting her mechanically demanding, and the result created a character who felt defined entirely by her vulnerability. The remake addressed this directly. Ashley in the 2023 version has more agency, more courage, more moments where she acts rather than simply reacts. She is still not a combatant, but she is a person rather than a gameplay complication. Fact 98. Ashley was designed in early development as an unnamed character simply called Girl. She was originally intended to be a fully playable second character across the castle and hallucination builds of the game. In one early scenario, she escaped an underground lab with the help of a BOW dog trained to follow her commands. That version of the character had independent agency and navigated the game's world on her own terms. As the game was rebuilt under Mikami's direction, she transitioned into the companion role, losing the gameplay autonomy but retaining the story centrality. Fact 99. The Plaga embryo implanted in Ashley was, according to the lore, a specially prepared one intended for her specific purpose. Sadler wanted her to be able to return to the United States without appearing obviously infected, at least in the short term. This required a variant that would develop slowly enough to survive the journey home and the transition back into normal political life, before activating fully and allowing Sadler to use her as his vector. The level of precision required for this, engineering an embryo that would remain dormant through specific conditions and then activate on command, speaks to the genuine sophistication of the research Luis was conducting under Sadler's direction. Fact 100. The laser surgery machine that removes the parasites from Leon and Ashley was built by Luis and left on the island specifically for this purpose. He knew the Plaga removal method. He built the equipment. He left it where Leon would logically end up based on the mission's trajectory. Whether this was strategic planning on Luis's part, a contingency built in from the start, or something that developed as he watched Leon's progress through the cult's defenses and made preparations accordingly, the lore does not entirely specify. Either interpretation requires crediting Luis with a level of forward thinking that goes well beyond ordinary defection behavior. Fact 101. Leon's parting exchange with Ashley at the end of the game has different tones depending on the version. In the original, Ashley invites Leon to come visit her sometime. His refusal is played with a kind of wry charm that closes the adventure with a light touch. In the remake, the exchange is different in specific details, but carries a similar warmth. Their dynamic throughout both versions of the game develops from a nervous professional transaction to something that feels like genuine mutual regard. She is not simply the mission objective by the end, and he is not simply the extraction asset. Fact 102. Ingrid Hunnigan, Leon's communications handler, appears only through radio and video calls in the game, but her voice and presence are consistent threads of connection to the world outside Valdalobos. When the communications are jammed, she disappears from the story for long stretches. Her return at the end of the game, when Leon reestablishes contact, functions as the first signal that the mission is concluding, that the world outside this nightmare is still there and accessible. She is a structural character, present to mark the boundary between the mission world and the normal world. Fact 103. Luis's description of himself as a researcher in the original game conceals both more and less than it reveals. He tells Leon he worked for the police in Madrid. He admits later he is actually a researcher who worked for Sadler. He does not tell Leon about his umbrella connection in the remake version. He manages his own disclosure carefully, giving Leon enough to establish trust while not volunteering information that would complicate that trust unnecessarily. This is not exactly lying. It is the behavior of someone who has learned, in very specific environments, that full disclosure of your history is rarely tactically wise. Fact 104. The remake's Separate Ways DLC gives Ada significantly more interior complexity than her original game appearances. The player is with her through her own decisions and can watch her making choices that are not explained by simple mercenary self-interest. Her protection of Leon is not required by her mission. Her betrayal of Wesker is professionally catastrophic for her. The choices she makes in the expanded story are the choices of someone operating from values, even if those values are her own and not easily categorized as conventional morality. She is not good in a simple sense. She is principled in a complicated one. Fact 105. Albert Wesker is present in the RE4 events only at the margins. He communicates with Ada and dispatches Krauser but does not appear physically in the events in Spain. His presence is felt through the HCF infrastructure and through the shadow of his plans over Ada's mission. By the time of RE4, he is already operating as the hidden hand behind multiple ongoing bioterrorist operations and is positioning himself to eventually attempt his Ouroboros project. RE4 is one piece of a larger chess game Wesker is playing across multiple boards simultaneously, and the board in Spain is not even his most important one. He barely notices the specific events there, except in terms of which samples he does or does not receive at the end of it. Section 6. The Biology of Horror, Ganados, Mutations, and Bioweapon Design. Facts 106 through 125. Fact 106. The central distinction between Las Plagas-infected Ganados and T-virus-infected zombies is cognitive function. Zombies in the early Resident Evil games are biologically simple threats. Slow, driven by hunger, incapable of coordinating with each other beyond basic mob behavior. Ganados retain enough of their original cognitive architecture to use weapons, coordinate ambushes, communicate with each other, operate machinery, and respond tactically to the specific situation in front of them. They can throw axes with accuracy. They can set up flanking maneuvers. They can use ladders and doors. Fighting Ganados requires genuine tactical thinking in a way that fighting standard zombies does not. Fact 107. The iconic image of a plaga organism erupting from the severed neck of a ganado, the writhing tentacled mass replacing the head after sufficiently massive cranial damage, is not a mutation that Sadler engineered. It is the parasite's emergency survival response. When the host's skull is destroyed, the plaga organism, which is nestled against the spine and integrated with the host's nervous system, loses the protection of the bone cavity and the camouflage of the host's face. What emerges is the actual parasite body, exposed, taking direct physical control of the host's remaining motor systems. It is the creature underneath the person, and you can only see it when the person's architecture is gone. Fact 108. The process by which villagers were originally infected through the mines is worth examining carefully. When the miners were sent to excavate the sealed caverns beneath the castle, they inhaled dormant plaga spores without knowing what they were breathing. The infection incubated. By the time symptoms might have become apparent, the cult's religious framing was already in place to explain whatever behavioral or physical changes people noticed. The miners became the first involuntary Ganados, and because the cult controlled the information environment around what was happening to them, there was no moment where the community could recognize what was occurring before it was too late to stop it. Fact 109. Armaduras are the animated suits of armor that attack Leon in Salazar's castle. They are not robots or mechanical constructions. They are plaga organisms that have been specially cultivated to inhabit and animate hollow suit of armor, using the metal structure as a kind of external skeleton. The plaga adapted to occupying a non-biological host body, integrating with the metal the way it would integrate with flesh, finding ways to move the inorganic structure through biological manipulation. They cannot be killed the way organic enemies can, because there is no body to damage. The armor must be destroyed, or the internal plaga organism dislodged. Fact 110. Del Lago is the enormous aquatic creature encountered in the lake outside the village. In the lore, it was originally a large salamander native to the lake ecosystem. After plaga infection, its body underwent unrestrained growth and mutation that transformed it into something more comparable to a prehistoric marine predator than anything currently living. The plaga clearly have very different developmental effects when they interact with non-human organisms than when they interact with human hosts. Del Lago is one of several examples in the game of the parasite treating non-human biology as an experimental canvas and producing something that cannot be easily categorized. Fact 111. The Novistator's ability to become invisible is not magic. It is a pigmentation mechanism similar to what cephalopods like octopuses and squid use in the real world. The difference is that cephalopod camouflage is a natural evolutionary adaptation. The Novistators is the product of plaga biology, amplifying and modifying an insect host's natural pigmentation capabilities far beyond anything the insect's original genome would have produced. The plaga essentially accessed the genetic toolkit of the insect's adaptive coloration and turned the dial far past its natural maximum. Fact 112. The research that produced the Regenerador required implanting multiple plaga organisms within a single human host rather than the usual single parasite. These organisms distribute themselves throughout the host's body and individually manage the regeneration of the tissue around them, damage a region of the body, and the local plaga organism accelerates tissue repair at a rate that exceeds the damage being dealt. The only way to outrun this regeneration is to eliminate each plaga organism individually, which requires either knowing where they are or using thermal imaging to locate them by the heat signature their biology generates. Fact 113. The plaga suppress the host's pain response, or at least significantly dampen it. This is not a side effect, but a functional necessity of the parasite's control mechanism. A ganado that registered pain at normal human levels would become non-functional under combat conditions. The pain suppression allows infected hosts to continue pursuing commands even after sustaining injuries that would normally incapacitate a person. It also means that ganados can appear to simply not notice damage that should be stopping them, creating the unsettling impression that they have decided not to be hurt, rather than simply being unable to feel it. Fact 114. In the original game, Luis's research contributed significantly to understanding the dominant plaga strain's properties. His creation of the suppressant that delays plaga development required a detailed knowledge of the parasite's growth cycle, its interaction with specific biochemical pathways in the human body, and the precise chemical intervention that could interfere with those pathways without killing the host. This is not simple work. It is the kind of targeted biochemistry that requires sustained research under laboratory conditions. Luis did this work inside the cult's own facility, using their equipment, producing results he was concealing from the people he was supposedly working for. Fact 115. Sadler's plaga, the one he carries, is implied to have some unique properties related to its interaction with the Queen plaga. In Ada's report documents, there is a suggestion that the Queen's command signals could potentially operate at a level that might even challenge Sadler's control. The amber-preserved plaga species is flagged as potentially capable of overriding the existing hierarchy. This detail, that the very organism Sadler is building his power structure around contains the seed of a challenge to that structure, is a piece of biological irony that the game plants and then does not fully develop. The cult's holy organism was never fully controllable. Sadler was managing something that retained the potential to manage him. Fact 116. The infection spread in Valdolobos was not limited to the human population. Animals in the region were also infected, creating the colmillos from the local wolf population and affecting other fauna. This ecological spread means the region as a whole was compromised, not just the human community. If you imagine trying to decontaminate Valdolobos after the events of RE4, you would be dealing not only with infrastructure and human remains, but with an entire local ecosystem that had been partially overwritten by the plaga biology. The contamination would be everywhere in the food chain. Fact 117. In the island facility, the research being conducted at the time of Leon's arrival was not merely maintaining existing bioweapons. Active development was continuing. New plaga variants were being worked on. The Regenerador program was apparently relatively recent in production terms. Sadler's team was iterating. They were not simply deploying existing weapons, but building toward the next generation of applications. The island was a live research facility with an active development pipeline, not a storage site for things already created. Fact 118. The Ganados' ability to recognize and respond to the command signals from dominant hosts is mediated through a biological frequency, rather than through any kind of supernatural mechanism. When a dominant host produces an ultrasonic frequency, the subordinate parasites within Ganado hosts receive it through their own biology and translate it into behavioral directives. This is a parasitic communication network that uses living bodies as nodes. Every infected person in the region is simultaneously an individual and a receiver in a biological radio network, with Sadler at the top as the transmitter. Fact 119. The plaga organisms appear to have a memory function that persists in the host beyond ordinary behavioral commands. Ganados retain enough cognitive architecture to remember how to do tasks they learned before infection. A villager who knew how to farm before the plaga still knows how to farm after. A soldier who trained with firearms before infection can still use them after. The parasite does not reset the host's learned capabilities. It redirects them. The knowledge is preserved. The will to use it independently is removed. This makes Ganados more useful as a controlled population than a T-virus zombie would be, but it also means that every Ganado carries the ghost of the person they used to be, preserved in their muscles and reflexes, doing the things that person knew how to do in service of someone else's will. Fact 120. One of the most significant limitations of the plaga control structure is what happens to the subordinate Ganados when the dominant host is removed. When Sadler dies, the command structure that was holding the entire plaga hierarchy together collapses. The Ganados under his influence lose their coordination. Without the continuous command signal from the dominant carrier, the subordinate parasites experience something analogous to signal loss. The behavior of the infected population without active dominant direction is not documented in detail in SURE RE4 specifically, but is implied to become chaotic and eventually self-destructive in the absence of any guiding structure. Fact 121. The amber sample that Luis steals and that Sadler kills him to recover is not simply a museum specimen. It is an active biological resource with strategic implications. The species of plaga preserved within it has properties that could potentially be used to develop a new dominant strain that might supersede Sadler's own control plaga. This is why Sadler is so specifically concerned about its theft. It is not just the loss of research material. It is the loss of something that, in the wrong hands or the right hands, could be used to directly undermine his biological authority over the entire infected population. He is not protecting a sample. He is protecting his throne. Fact 122. The plaga's life cycle involves an embryonic stage during which the organism is dormant and can be preserved in substrate like amber for extremely long periods without losing viability. An active stage during which the organism integrates with a host, navigates their biology, and begins establishing the neural connections that will allow it to suppress or maintain autonomous function depending on the species. And a mature stage at which the organism's relationship with the host is fully established and the behavioral control mechanisms are operating at maximum efficiency. Disrupting the development at any stage is possible with the right biochemical intervention, which is what Luis's suppressant achieves. Fact 123. After the events of REI4, research into plaga biology continued globally. The organism made its way to Africa through the international arms trade, and Tricell's research division developed types 2 and 3 of the Plaga genus from the original samples. These engineered variants had different infection mechanisms and different control properties than the Valdolobos original. Type 2 infected through oral consumption and attached directly to the medulla oblongata, bypassing the spine-based integration of the original. Each new type expanded the parasite's potential applications while introducing new risks and failure modes. The research never stopped. It simply changed hands and changed locations. Fact 124. The insect-human hybridization program that produced the Verdugo and the Novistadores required a different approach to Plaga engineering than the standard infection protocol. Simply infecting a human with a standard Plaga would not produce an insect-human hybrid. The research required introducing insect genetic material alongside the Plaga, using the parasite's own integration biology as the mechanism for incorporating foreign DNA into the host's cellular architecture. This is a significantly more sophisticated application of Plaga biology than basic infection. It is using the parasite as a gene delivery vector as much as a behavioral control mechanism. Fact 125. The full catalog of BOWs present in the Valdolobos operation, from El Gigante to the Verdugo to the Regeneradores to the Novistadores, represents a research program that must have taken years of sustained development. It did not materialize overnight. The Plaga were excavated from the mines and then subjected to what had to be years of systematic experimentation before stable, useful bioweapon variants were achieved. This timeline means that the conversion of the village, the beginning of mass ganado infections, and the serious research operations on the island were all happening concurrently over an extended period, with Sadler managing all of it simultaneously, while maintaining the appearance of a merely unusual religious community to the outside world. Section 7. The Island, the Conspiracy, and the Bigger Picture. Facts 126 through 150. Fact 126. The island that serves as Resident Evil 4's final act location is a military facility of significant scale. It contains research laboratories, holding cells, weapon storage, warship docking, anti-aircraft installations, and barracks for a trained mercenary and soldier force. This is not a cult compound in any ordinary sense. This is a privately funded military installation with the research capacity of a mid-sized biotech company and the combat infrastructure of a small armed force. Building this, equipping it, and staffing it required resources far beyond what a rural Spanish cult could generate internally. Fact 127. The mercenaries and soldiers on the island are distinct from the villagers and castle zealots. They are professional fighters who were infected with Plaga after being hired and subjected to the same infection protocol as everyone else in Sadler's organization. The difference is that their pre-infection training gave the subordinate Plaga more sophisticated behavioral frameworks to work with. A soldier's combat knowledge, retained after infection, produces a more dangerous ganado than a farmer's agricultural knowledge. The same parasite, the same control mechanism, applied to a more dangerous underlying skill set. Fact 128. The U3 organism encountered on the island is one of the most unclassifiable creatures in the game. Its design suggests the integration of multiple biological sources into a single host, creating something that is partially humanoid, partially arachnid, and partially something that resists easy categorization. It was clearly the product of sophisticated Plaga-based genetic engineering, but the exact research pathway that produced it is not documented in accessible in-game files. In the remake, elements of U3 were merged with the second Verdugo encounter, which is one of several instances where the remake consolidated and refocused some of the original's more disparate enemy roster. Fact 129. The island also housed the laser surgery equipment that Luis designed for Plaga removal. The placement of this equipment within the same facility that was producing the Plaga and conducting BOW research suggests that Luis had managed to embed a kind of hidden safety infrastructure within the cult's own operation. He knew how to remove the parasite. He built the machine that could do it. He placed it in the location where it could be accessed by someone who had made it through the entire operational gauntlet. This was not accident. This was someone inside a monstrous system, quietly building a door in the wall. Fact 130. Albert Wesker's organization, HCF, sometimes referred to as the agency in certain CRE lore documents, was a competitor to Umbrella Corporation in the bioweapon acquisition and development space. By the time of ERE-4, Wesker had already separated from Umbrella and was building his own independent power base. The RE-4 operation was one of several simultaneous efforts to acquire advanced bioweapons material for the plan that would eventually become the Ouroboros project in Resident Evil 5. Valdilobos was an acquisition mission embedded inside a rescue mission that Wesker had no particular interest in. Fact 131. The connection between the ERE-4 events and Resident Evil Village is more direct than it might initially appear. In the Village lore, the Connections, an organization that would later engineer Eveline, obtained mold samples from Mother Miranda. Miranda had been approached by Oswell Spencer in the 1950s after he learned her methods. Spencer founded Umbrella. The Las Plagas research and the mold research represent parallel tracks of the same fundamental horror. Different organisms, different decades, different parts of Europe, all connected through Spencer's initial encounter with an ancient parasite mythology and his decision to industrialize it. The roots of Village run through the same ground as the roots of RE-4. Fact 132. The USSTRA-TCOM designation applied to the official Resident Evil 4 mission in certain documents has been the subject of significant debate in the fan community regarding its canonical accuracy. The organization's exact nature, whether it is the same as the broader government agency Leon works for, or a specific operational command structure for this mission, has been clarified differently in different sources over the years. What is clear is that the operation had official U.S. government sanction and that its objectives were understood to include the recovery of Ashley Graham and the neutralization of the Illuminados' bioweapon threat. Fact 133. The specific village in Spain where the game takes place is called Valdilobos. The name means Valley of Wolves in Spanish. Given that the game includes colmillos, the plaga-infected wolves, and that the region's pre-Illuminados history involves indigenous communities with deep connections to the natural landscape, the name carries a specific resonance. The valley's wolves were there long before the cult. They just did not have tentacles until recently. Fact 134. The island's communications were reportedly being monitored by parties other than Sadler's operation. Intelligence about the island's activities had reached multiple organizations before Leon ever arrived in Valdilobos. The BSAA, which was still in its early formation during this period, had fragments of information about Plaga-related bioweapon development in the region. Wesker's network had more detailed intelligence. The fact that nobody intervened earlier says something about the international intelligence community's priorities and operational capacities at the time. They knew things were happening. The response was insufficient until a specific political trigger, the kidnapping of the president's daughter, created an urgency that general bioweapon research warnings had not. Fact 135. Ada's jet ski, left at the island's dock as the explosives countdown begins, is not an accident or convenience. She prepared it. She knew or calculated that Leon would need an extraction route after the island's detonation sequence began. She also knew he was not going to accept a seat in her helicopter when his mission objective included getting Ashley Graham safely out of the blast radius. The jet ski is a provision made for someone Ada understands well enough to anticipate, left in a specific location by someone who had thought through what that person would need, and arranged it in advance without being asked. Fact 136. The island's destruction was triggered by Ada's explosives, not Leon's actions. Leon did not blow up the island. Ada did. Her acquisition of the explosive material and her decision to use it to destroy the facility was part of her own mission parameters or her own judgment call. This means that the final cleansing of the Illuminados' research and military infrastructure was the work of someone who was theoretically operating in opposition to Leon's mission objectives. Ada blew up the island because she judged it should be destroyed, and her judgment was correct, even if her employer did not share it. Fact 137. The Kennedy Report, the mission debrief document Leon submits after the events of RE-4, is referenced in later Resident Evil lore as an important intelligence document. Its contents, whatever specific details Leon chose to include about the Plaga biology, the Illuminados' organizational structure, the bioweapon types, and the island facility, shaped how the broader anti-bioterrorism community understood the new threat category they were dealing with. The Plaga had not been in anyone's operational playbook before Valdilobos. After it, organizations like the BSAA had at least a foundation for understanding what they might face in subsequent encounters. Fact. 138. The events of Resident Evil 4 take place over approximately 2 days. The compressed timeline is rarely commented on, but it is extraordinary when you actually trace it. Leon arrives in Spain, makes his way to the village, navigates the village environment, survives the night attacks, works through the castle, rides a minecart, navigates the sewers, encounters multiple boss fights, reaches the island, navigates its military and research infrastructure, removes his parasite, fights the final boss, and escapes a collapsing island in under 48 hours. His physical resilience during this period is either a function of the Plaga embryo inside him providing some biological benefit to his endurance, or it is the game's timeline being compressed for narrative purposes, or both. Fact. 139. The international diplomatic dimension of the incident is not examined in detail within the game itself, but exists in the background. Sadler had apparently done enough work managing the Spanish authorities' awareness of his operation that there was no Spanish military or police presence in the Valdalobos region during Leon's mission. An American government agent was conducting a rescue operation involving the kidnapping of the U.S. president's daughter on Spanish soil, against an organization the Spanish authorities presumably knew existed in their territory, without any apparent Spanish government coordination or presence. The diplomatic arrangements that allowed this to happen are not discussed. They are simply assumed. Fact 140. The Plaga samples that Ada delivers to Wesker at the end of ERE4, specifically the subordinate strain rather than the dominant one she was supposed to retrieve, feed into Wesker's ongoing Ouroboros research, but not in the way he planned. The subordinate sample gives him partial utility, but not the control applications he needed from the dominant strain. He eventually obtained a control plaga through unspecified means that the lore does not fully detail. Ricardo Irving, a black market dealer who appears in Resident Evil 5, is identified as one of the few people who might have known how Las Plagas made their way to Africa. The chain of custody for the post-ERE4 Plaga samples is deliberately murky. Fact 141. The events of RE4 are officially classified. The U.S. government's acknowledgement of the Illuminados incident is partial and carefully managed. The public narrative around Ashley Graham's disappearance and return does not include the details of what she experienced, what she was infected with, what it would have meant if Leon had been an hour slower, or what kind of organization was responsible. The scale of what nearly happened, a parasite-controlled U.S. government, is information that never becomes public knowledge in the canon. The world goes about its business not knowing how close it came to something that would have ended the possibility of any business as usual. Fact 142. The Plaga's debut in the canon represents a significant shift in how the Resident Evil universe understands the category of biological threat. Before the Plaga, the standard framework was infection, leading to physical transformation and loss of complex cognitive function. Zombies, monsters, things that looked wrong and behaved wrong and could be identified by the fact that they were trying to eat you. The Plaga introduced a category of infected person who looks normal, behaves with tactical intelligence, and might not be identifiable as a threat until they are already in a position to harm you. The infected villager who seems to be going about their day until the moment Sadler issues a command, that is a different kind of horror than a zombie, and the world of Resident Evil after 2004 had to develop new frameworks for dealing with it. Fact 143. In an odd piece of lore connectivity, there is a suggestion in the broader series that the Plaga research and the progenitor virus research conducted by Umbrella existed in the same intellectual ecosystem. Spencer learned about directed mutation from Miranda. Miranda's work influenced the conceptual framework that produced Umbrella's bioweapon development. And the Plaga, discovered independently through a completely different evolutionary path, demonstrated some of the same theoretical possibilities that Umbrella had been pursuing through the progenitor virus. Two different organisms, two different regions of the world, two different cultures of worship around the same underlying concept, that life itself could be redirected, amplified, and turned into a tool of control. Fact 144. The aftermath of ERE4 left the island destroyed, the village and castle effectively non-functional as organized operation sites, the cult leadership dead, and the research capabilities dismantled. But it also left an unknown number of still infected villagers. The Ganados who survived the events of the game. People who had been converted to the cult years or decades earlier and now existed in a region where the dominant control structure had been eliminated. What happened to those people, whether the plaga within them eventually died, whether they recovered their autonomy to any degree, whether they were quietly removed by government cleanup operations, is not addressed in the lore. They are the invisible aftermath, the people the story walked past on its way to the explosion. Fact 145. Sadler's ambition was global, but his operation was fundamentally regional. He controlled Valdalobos. He had reach into certain black market channels through which he obtained his military hardware. He had communication channels with Wesker's network through Krauser, but his actual power was concentrated in a few square kilometers of rural Spain and a small island off the coast. He was planning world domination from a platform that had no projection capability beyond what the Ashley Graham plan would have provided. The entire world domination scheme rested on a single point of contact, the president's daughter, arriving in Washington and making the right political relationships happen. One person, one plaga, one uncontrolled variable, which turned out to be Leon Kennedy. Fact 146. The concept of the Los Illuminados and their parasite-based mind control anticipated real-world research into the mechanisms of parasites that alter host behavior. Ophiocordyceps fungi, the real organism that infects ants and manipulates their behavior to benefit the fungus, had been studied for years before RE4 was developed, but had not yet achieved the popular cultural prominence it gained. After The Last of Us used a similar concept in 2013, RE4 was working in this biological horror space before it became a mainstream fixture of the genre. Fact 147. One of the things that makes the RE4 narrative structurally elegant is how it stages its three environments as thematically distinct escalations. The village is intimate and grounded. It is about a community transformed, ordinary people in ordinary spaces doing terrible things. The castle is theatrical and baroque. It is about power and ceremony and the performance of authority through elaborate architecture and trained cruelty. The island is functional and industrial. It is about military production and bioweapon deployment. Each space reveals a different facet of what Los Illuminados actually were: community cult, aristocratic power structure, military-industrial operation. Fact 148. The merchant who appears throughout all three sections of the game, setting up shop in impossible locations with complete and constantly refreshed inventory, is one of the most persistently unexplained elements in the entire series. He sells to Leon without apparent allegiance to Sadler's operation. He appears in the castle without any visible means of entry. His presence in the island's deepest sections defies any ordinary logistical explanation. The Duke in Resident Evil Village explicitly references the RA4 merchant as an old friend, creating a direct continuity between the two characters that suggests both are instances of something larger that the series has not yet fully explained. His famous question, asking what you are buying, has become one of the most recognized lines in gaming history, without any explanation of who is asking it. Fact 149. The cultural touchstone quality of Resident Evil 4 means that specific moments from it have entered the general consciousness of gaming culture to a degree that few games achieve. The cheese purchase, the dog that rescues Leon from the bear trap and occasionally returns to help during combat, the chainsaw Ganado's specific audio, the lake sequence, Salazar's elaborate death trap monologues. These elements are not merely memorable within the game. They have become part of the shared language of people who play games, reference points that communicate something specific about tone, design philosophy, and the experience of playing something that was genuinely new. Fact 150. The 2023 remake of Resident Evil 4 was developed over several years and aimed not simply to update the visual presentation, but to reconsider certain design and narrative choices from a contemporary perspective. The changes made to Ashley, to Luis, to Ada's role in the story, to the knife mechanics, to the presentation of certain character relationships, collectively represent a sustained engagement with what made the original meaningful and what had aged in ways that warranted revision. The remake exists in a different relationship with the original than most remakes do. it is not a replacement. It is a parallel text, a version that asks what these characters and this story might look like if the same essential elements were brought to a different lens. Section 8. Development History, Secrets, and Hidden Details. Facts 151 through 175. Fact 151. Development on Resident Evil 4 began in 1999 under Hideki Kamiya, who was handed the project by series creator Shinji Mikami. The game that Kamiya initially developed was described internally as too cool and too far removed from the survival horror roots of the series. It was packed with action, heavy in style, and simply did not feel like Resident Evil in any meaningful sense. Mikami intervened. He concluded that the Kamiya build, while genuinely impressive, should become its own property rather than carry the Resident Evil brand. That decision led directly to the creation of Devil May Cry, one of the most beloved action game series ever made. Two franchises exist today because of a single development meeting. Fact 152. After Kamiya's version became Devil May Cry, a new team under Yasuhisa Kawamura and Hiroshi Shibata developed what became known as the Castle build. This version kept Leon as the protagonist and introduced a castle setting, a version of the mysterious girl character who would eventually become Ashley, and an approach to horror that leaned on atmosphere and isolation. The Castle build also contained a prototype story involving the progenitor virus as an organism of ancient supernatural origin, preserved in the mummified remains of an ancient superhuman ruler. Elements of this story are philosophically connected to what actually appeared in RE4, even though the specific details were entirely replaced. Fact 153. The hallucination concept was the most uncanny of the early RE4 builds. In this version, the central horror mechanic was that Leon was being stalked by an entity with supernatural abilities who could manipulate his perception of reality. The game was experimenting with the idea of psychological horror, where the player could not trust what they were seeing. A demonstration video of this concept was released publicly and generated significant excitement and discussion before the build was ultimately abandoned. The ghost-like entity in it had a quality that no Resident Evil game before or since has quite replicated. This build was eventually repurposed and refined into a separate IP, the game Haunting Ground. Fact 154. The zombie build was a version developed after the hallucination concept was discarded. It attempted to split the difference between the Castle build's atmosphere and a more conventional enemy roster. The central enemies in this version were zombie-like creatures called Daba Men, which would be controlled by parasitic organisms. This is strikingly close to what the final game actually did with Ganados and Las Plagas. The zombie build was halted relatively quickly by Mikami, who was concerned the game's sales would stagnate if it felt too familiar and formulaic. Ironically, the concept it was exploring, parasite-controlled enemies who retained more function than standard zombies, was exactly the direction the finished game went in. Fact 155. Shinji Mikami took over direct development of Resident Evil 4 in late 2003 as an emergency measure. Capcom's management had issued what amounted to an ultimatum. Mikami was told that if Resident Evil 4 did not sell well, Capcom would not make any more games in the series. He had taken over a project that had been in development for 4 years without producing a finished game. He had the franchise's survival as a creative property riding on whatever he produced next. The pressure was not abstract, it was existential. And under those conditions, he built one of the most influential games ever made. Fact 156. Mikami was directly inspired by his experience playing Onimusha 3 to implement the over-the-shoulder camera system that defines RE4's gameplay. He found the third-person perspective in that game compelling, but felt it could be better realized. His decision to place the camera directly behind Leon and tie it to Leon's movement created the aiming system that distinguishes RE4 from every Resident Evil before it and influenced virtually every third-person action game that followed. The fixed camera era of Resident Evil did not simply end with this game. It was actively, deliberately replaced by something Mikami had been thinking about since before the first Resident Evil was made. Fact 157. Mikami had actually planned to use a similar camera system for the original 1996 Resident Evil, but was constrained by the technological limitations of PlayStation hardware at the time. What appeared in RE4 in 2005 was in some sense a design intention that had been waiting for hardware capable of realizing it for nearly a decade. The over-the-shoulder system was not a radical departure from Mikami's vision. It was the vision, finally running on hardware that could support it. Fact 158. Mikami famously and publicly stated before Resident Evil 4's release that it would be a GameCube exclusive and that he would cut his own head off if it came to PlayStation 2. The statement was obviously rhetorical hyperbole, but it committed him very publicly to a platform exclusivity that did not ultimately hold. The game was announced for PlayStation 2, released within the same calendar year as its GameCube launch. Mikami later gave apologies for the game going multi-platform. The incident was significant enough to be referenced in Capcom's game God Hand, which included a racing dog named Mikami's head as a winking acknowledgement of the broken promise. Fact 159. Resident Evil 4 was released in January 2005 for GameCube in Japan and North America and sold 1.25 million copies on that platform within a year. This was exceptional performance for a GameCube title at a period when the console was significantly underperforming commercially against PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 port, released later in 2005, expanded the game's reach substantially and introduced the separate ways and assignment, ADA content as exclusive additions to that version. The PC port followed in 2007. Over its many iterations and re-releases across decades, the game has sold over 17 million copies across all platforms. Fact 160. The original game was developed using a proprietary Capcom engine that presented the development team with significant technical challenges. Some of the game's model data was too large for any console available at the time to load as a continuous stream, which is cited in development accounts as one of the reasons the project went through so many rebuilds. The final game required careful management of asset loading and streaming in ways that the team had to develop specifically for this title. Fact 161. The merchant character in RE4 was not originally planned as a recurring fixture throughout the entire game. In early development discussions, the concept of a traveling vendor who could appear in multiple locations was developed as a practical solution to the game's economy and upgrade system. The design team had to figure out how to give the player access to weapons, ammunition, and upgrades in a way that felt consistent with the game's world. A wandering merchant who moved between locations and was simply present when you needed them was the answer. The character became iconic specifically because the team committed to the absurdity of his presence without ever trying to explain it. Fact 162. Paul Mercier voiced Leon Kennedy in the original English release of Resident Evil 4, and in the Degeneration and Darkside Chronicles productions that followed. His voice work defined Leon's sardonic, understated delivery through a significant period of the character's development. When the casting shifted to Matthew Mercer for Resident Evil 6 and the subsequent animated films, and then to Nick Apostolides for the remakes of RE2 and RE4, each transition represented a different reading of the same character. Apostolides' RE4 remake. Leon carries more evident weight, more visible exhaustion beneath the competence than Mercier's original, which tracks with what the remake is doing to Leon's characterization overall. Fact 163. Ashley Graham was voiced by Carolyn Lawrence in the original game. Lawrence is perhaps best known to certain audiences as the voice of Sandy Cheeks in SpongeBob SquarePants, a detail that has generated a specific kind of mental dissonance in players who discover it. In the remake, Ashley is voiced by Genevieve Buchner in English and Akari Kito in Japanese. The remake Ashley's voice performance was widely praised as a significant improvement over the original in terms of portraying a young woman under extreme stress rather than a helplessness signaling game mechanic. Fact 164. The game's opening sequence, Leon walking down a dirt road to the village as his Spanish police escorts are killed by the infected, was designed to establish tone immediately. The world of RE4 is not the laboratory corridors and police station hallways of earlier games. It is open, rural, cold in the way that real countryside can be cold. The transition from the institutional spaces of previous Resident Evil games to this muddy, fire-lit, fog-draped village environment was deliberate and complete. This game was not going to be set in anything familiar. The unfamiliarity was the point. Fact 165. The design of the Ganados as enemies who would throw projectiles, set flanking positions, use ladders to reach elevated vantage points, break down doors, and coordinate with each other across distance required significantly more complex enemy AI than the series had used before. Previous Resident Evil enemies were mobile threats that required navigation. Ganados were mobile threats that required tactical responses. The distinction demanded a completely different combat system and camera arrangement to make engaging with them feel manageable rather than simply overwhelming. Fact 166. Resident Evil 4 introduced the inventory management system using the attaché case, which allowed players to physically arrange items within a grid space to maximize what they could carry. This was a design choice that made inventory management itself a puzzle element, a quiet strategy layer running beneath the combat and exploration. The attaché case became iconic in a way that extended beyond the game itself. It is a recognizable image in gaming culture, shorthand for a certain kind of meticulous, resource-conscious approach to survival. Fact 167. The game's pacing is one of its most analyzed qualities from a design perspective. It moves through distinct beats, periods of sustained tension and resource pressure, followed by brief moments of relative safety or discovery. The merchant appears at these transition points. The chapters conclude with boss encounters that serve as release valves for accumulated pressure. Salazar's theatrical monologues provide tonal counterpoint to the danger. The structure is almost musical in how it manages the player's emotional state over the 12 to 15 hours of a first playthrough. Fact 168. In the 2023 remake's development, the team made specific decisions about which enemy types to carry forward and which to reconfigure or remove. The Chainsaw Man, Dr. Salvador, was preserved and expanded. The Regeneradors were redesigned to move more fluidly and be more aggressively terrifying. Certain enemies were consolidated, with the second Verdugo's confrontation merged with the U3 encounter into a single reimagined sequence. The team's approach was not simple recreation, but active interrogation of each element, asking whether it contributed to the experience and what it would need to become to work in the remake's more grounded and psychologically weighty version of the same story. Fact 169. The Luis Serra character was designed, in the words of his original character artist Masaki Yamanaka, to visually rival Leon and look like an Aragorn-type figure drawn from Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, which were still culturally dominant during REE4's development period. This design intention explains something about Luis's visual presentation, the slightly weathered romanticism, the quality of someone who belongs to a more heroic register than the world around him allows. He was designed to look like he should be the hero of a different, perhaps better story. Fact 170. The trial edition of Resident Evil 4, that was produced during the game's late development, featured differences from the final release that have become fascinating artifacts for longtime fans. Luis with a mustache, certain enemy placements that were changed before shipping, slight differences in dialogue timing. These elements exist in a small number of physical copies and in the documentation produced from that stage of development. They are windows into the last iteration of the game before it became the thing that millions of people know. Fact 171. Several lines of dialogue in the original game have become so embedded in gaming culture that they function as references with immediate recognizability far outside the Resident Evil community. The merchant's greetings and sign-off phrases, Leon's exchanges with Salazar, the specific delivery of lines like, "Where's everyone going? Bingo," and "Your right hand comes off." These are not considered good dialogue in any conventional literary sense. They are considered good dialogue in the sense that they exist precisely and perfectly in the space of tone, circumstance, and character that the game creates around them. Fact 172. The remake chose to revise several of the more critically noted lines from the original, particularly dialogue around Ashley that had aged poorly in terms of how it positioned her relative to Leon. The changes were noted by reviewers and fans and largely received positively as adjustments that preserve the tone of the characters' relationship while removing elements that read as dismissive or reductive. This kind of conscious revision in a remake is relatively rare and reflects a considered position on what the original material was doing and what the contemporary version was trying to be. Fact 173. One of the most significant ways Resident Evil 4 changed the broader landscape of action games was by establishing a grammar for the over-the-shoulder third-person shooter that was subsequently adopted and adapted by an enormous number of titles. The stop-to-aim mechanic, the visual intimacy of the over-shoulder camera with the player character, the way enemy encounters were designed around this specific perspective, all of it became a template. Games like Gears of War, Uncharted, The Last of Us, and many others built on a foundation that Resident Evil 4's combat architecture helped define. Its influence is visible in the fundamental mechanics of modern third-person action design. Fact: 174. Resident Evil 4 Remake received widespread critical acclaim upon its release in March 2023, earning multiple Game of the Year nominations and awards across the industry. The remake was praised specifically for how it balanced respect for the original with a willingness to genuinely reimagine characters and moments rather than simply recreating them with better graphics. The Separate Ways DLC, released later in 2023, expanded this reception further and was credited with giving Ada Wong the most substantial and complex characterization she had received across her entire history in the series. Fact 175. The legacy of Resident Evil 4 is not simply that it saved a franchise that was commercially struggling, though it did that. It is not simply that it influenced an entire generation of game design, though it did that too. Its deepest legacy might be that it demonstrated something about how horror can coexist with spectacle, that a game could be genuinely frightening and genuinely funny and genuinely moving in the same hour, that the line between a monster and a person infected by something they did not choose was a line worth examining slowly and carefully rather than simply pointing at the monster and pulling the trigger. The village in Spain, the castle on the hill, the island in the cold water, these are places built to be feared, but they are also places built to be understood. And there is something almost peaceful about understanding things that were built to frighten you, sitting with the full picture of what they are and how they came to be, watching the last of the light drain out of them in the dark. That is all 175. Every fact laid out across the whole long architecture of what Resident Evil 4 actually is. The history under the history, the biology under the cult, the people under the monsters, the game that refused to be simple, even when simple would have been enough. The village is quiet now. The castle has been empty for 20 years of real time, though the lore says it still happened only a few months back, somewhere in 2004. Sadler is dead. The island is at the bottom of the ocean. Leon eventually filed his report and went home, or went to wherever a government agent goes when the mission is over, and there is nowhere quite that deserves the name home. If this video found you tired, if it carried you somewhere past wakefulness into that comfortable half-dark, where facts become textures and details become sounds, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. The Resident Evil universe is a strange place to spend your sleeping hours, but for a certain kind of person, there is something genuinely restful about knowing all the corners of a darkness you have already decided is manageable. If you made it this far, even halfway, even a quarter of the way before your eyes closed, please hit that like button if you enjoyed it. It makes an enormous difference for getting this kind of content to the people who want it. Subscribe if you want more of these long, slow dives into game lore, because there is a lot more world to explore and a lot more nights where the details are worth knowing. Leave a comment. Tell me something you noticed in the video. Tell me a fact about RE4 that you carry around and that I didn't include. Tell me it's 3 in the morning and you are watching from somewhere small and quiet. Those comments are always the best ones. Sleep well. Afterward, things worth carrying. There is something specific that Resident Evil 4 does that most games in its genre do not. It asks you to spend time in a place that has been thoroughly ruined, not by accident, not by natural disaster, not by war in any conventional sense, but by a sequence of individual choices made by people who each had reasons that felt, from the inside, like sufficient justification. Sadler wanted power. Salazar wanted atonement and belonging after being left alone too early. Mendez wanted to serve something worth serving. The villagers wanted to be faithful, to belong to a community, to have their suffering assigned meaning. These are not exotic motivations. They are ordinary ones. The same desires that move everyone in every part of the world, in every era of history. What made them catastrophic was the specific combination of an ancient organism with mind-controlling properties, a charismatic leadership structure that understood exactly how to dress biological enslavement in the language of divine grace, and a long enough timeline without outside intervention that the corruption could normalize itself layer by layer. The most frightening thing about Valdalobos is not the Ganados. It is the timeline of how Valdalobos became the place where the Ganados exist. That took years. It took patience and strategy, and the quiet accumulation of control over one community that the outside world mostly ignored because it was small and remote and did not seem to be anyone's problem until the president's daughter was taken, and suddenly it very specifically was. Leon walks into that history without knowing its full shape. He finds out as he goes. Each section of the game reveals another layer, another depth of what was built there and why. By the end, standing on a collapsing island with a rocket launcher and a person he was sent to rescue, he knows enough. He probably does not know everything. He cannot know about Miranda and Spencer and the chain that led here from a cave in Eastern Europe in 1919, but he knows what was in front of him, and he handled it. And he went home, and he filed his report. The report went into files. The files went into operational databases. The plaga went into the black market. The knowledge spread. And somewhere in the years that followed, someone read about what had happened in Valdalobos and started asking questions about the parasite and what it could do. That is how these things persist. Not through the survival of the monsters, through the survival of the idea that the monsters were possible. Rest easy, the village is a long way from here.